A single father built a house out of trash to save his son. Teenagers destroyed everything. But the next morning he opened the door and saw people. See what happened when everyone stopped being silent. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The hospital doors slid shut behind him with a quiet whoosh, sealing in the sterile air and the final chapter of the life he once knew. Elias Rhodes stepped onto the cracked pavement, his boots heavy with rain and memory. In one arm he held a newborn, swaddled in a thin hospital blanket, his tiny face tucked close to Elias's chest, unaware of the world he'd just entered. In the other hand, Elias clutched a plastic bag filled with documents, birth certificate, discharge papers, and a death notice bearing the name of the woman he loved. The ink hadn't yet dried on her absence. Rain clung to the air in a fine mist. It gathered in Elias's hair, soaked through his collar, and dripped from his jawline. He had no umbrella, no stroller, no home waiting, just the weight of a baby boy and the deafening silence of grief. They had named the child Luca. That was her name, not his. She'd whispered it once, when her voice was barely more than breath, fingers trembling against Elias's wrist. He had nodded, unable to speak, unwilling to believe that minutes later he'd be holding his son while the machines around her went still. The street outside the hospital was empty, the city muffled beneath the gray morning. Elias turned right without thinking, his body carrying him forward even as his mind spiraled. He had no plan, no destination. The apartment they had shared was gone, the lease voided, the keys turned in after the final unpaid notice. Friends had drifted over the years, and the family he'd once called his own was more ghost than blood. He pulled his jacket tighter around Luca and walked. For hours he wandered the outskirts of the city, slipping through alleys and abandoned lots, stepping over broken glass and crushed beer cans. He passed people who wouldn't meet his gaze, others who stared too long. The baby slept, miraculously, as if he knew that wakefulness would only make things harder. Elias tried the city shelter first. The man at the front desk looked him over once, eyes pausing on the child. "No kids," the man muttered, not unkindly but without apology. "No space, liability, you understand." He didn't argue. He left. At a community church, he was offered a sandwich and a cot for the night if he agreed to let Lucas sleep in a separate nursery. Elias shook his head, stepped back into the rain, and kept walking. By sunset, his arms ached. The baby was stirring, fussing beneath the blanket. He found an old bus shelter near an industrial lot and curled himself into the corner, using his coat as a windbreak. Luca whimpered softly until Elias pressed a warm bottle to his lips. Leftover formula a nurse had quietly slipped into his bag before discharge. It was barely enough. He knew it wouldn't last the night. As the sky darkened to charcoal, Elias closed his eyes and leaned his head against the cold metal of the bench. His mind clawed through everything at once: grief, hunger, exhaustion, fear. But louder than all of it was the thought that repeated like a drumbeat behind his eyes. This baby has no one else. The hours passed slowly. Rain tapped against the plastic roof. Cars passed without stopping. The city breathed around them, vast and indifferent. Sometime after midnight, Elias woke to the sound of a police siren in the distance. He reached instinctively for Luca, cradling him close, heart pounding. But no one came. The siren faded. Still, sleep would not return. By morning, the bottle was empty. So was Elias. He stood, his body aching, and began walking again. He stopped at gas stations, asking quietly for warm water or baby food. Some attendants looked away, others pointed to the door. One woman, maybe a mother herself, handed him a half-full carton of pre-mixed formula and said nothing. He nodded in thanks and slipped it into the bag beside the child. The city was less cruel than it was careless. People saw but didn't see. They passed Elias the way one passed a stray dog or a cracked sidewalk, aware but untouched. 2 days later, he stood outside the apartment complex where he and Alina had once lived. The building loomed over him, familiar and foreign. He stared at the buzzer panel, fingers hovering near the numbers. He thought of pressing the button for her cousin's unit, Kara, the one who'd smiled at their wedding and vanished the moment Alina got sick. But his hand dropped. He knew how that conversation would go. Accusations, pity, blame, and still no roof. He walked away without looking back. That night he found an abandoned food truck behind a shuttered diner. The back door was ajar, the floor littered with moldy cardboard and rusted shelves. It was filthy, but dry. He spread his jacket on the metal floor, laid Luca gently on top, and curled around him. He whispered stories into the child's ear. Stories he made up as he went, tales of forests and flying birds, of quiet houses and roaring fires. He told him about a mother he'd never meet and a father who was trying. In the morning, the food truck was gone. Someone had come in the night and driven it away while Elias slept in the grass nearby. He never heard the engine, never even stirred. The days blurred after that. Some nights they found shelter behind dumpsters or in construction scaffolding. Other times Elias walked through the night just to keep Luca warm against his chest. He learned to read people's faces, the ones who might give, the ones who might take. He learned how to heat formula with warm water from public restroom sinks, how to clean a bottle with hand soap and a paper towel. Once, a woman gave him a clean onesie still in its packaging. Another time, a teenage boy dropped a dollar bill into the stroller without a word. Elias never asked for help, but sometimes help found them anyway. Still, none of it was enough. Not really. Every day felt like a gamble. Every night felt like a battle. Elias didn't know how much longer he could go on like this. And then it happened. Luca smiled. It was early morning, and they were sitting beneath the overhang of an old train station. The sun had just started to rise, its light filtering through the rusted beams. Elias was holding the baby close, whispering nonsense to keep him calm. And then, out of nowhere, the boy smiled wide and toothless, eyes bright. Elias froze. The world stopped moving. It was the first true smile, not a flicker or a twitch, but a deliberate full-bodied light that lit up the infant's entire face. Elias felt something inside him break and reassemble all at once. In that moment, soaked in shadows and silence, he made a decision. No more running. No more hiding behind corners and benches and broken things. He would build something. Not someday. Now. Not a dream. Not a drawing. A place. A space. He didn't know how. He didn't know with what. But he would build a shelter. A wall. A roof. A home. Even if it was made from garbage and bent nails and prayers, it would be real. It would be theirs. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the warehouse skyline, Elias pushed the stroller toward a place he hadn't been in years, a forgotten corner of the industrial district, a brick factory long since shuttered, a back lot overgrown with weeds and rusted wire. It had once held trucks and cargo and noise. Now it held silence, space. To anyone else, it looked like a place to avoid. To Elias, it looked like possibility. He wheeled Luca into the clearing and stopped. Wind rustled the chain-link fence. A single crow squawked from a nearby pole. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elias exhaled slowly and looked down at his son. "This," he whispered without words, "is where we start." He stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his clothes, the dusk wrapping around them like smoke. And then he knelt, pressed his palm into the dirt, and began to imagine where the first wall might go. The sky grew dark. The stars blinked into life one by one. Elias didn't move. He didn't need to. The foundation had already been laid. Morning came cold and colorless, the sky still holding on to the weight of night as Elias sat cross-legged in the dirt, eyes scanning the overgrown lot behind the abandoned factory. His body ached from sleep that never came, and his clothes clung damply to his skin. Beside him, the baby stirred in the stroller, lips parting in a quiet yawn as his arms stretched upward, still uncoordinated and soft. Elias reached over, brushing a finger across his son's tiny knuckles, grounding himself in that fragile gesture. He had spent the hours before dawn drawing invisible lines in the soil with the edge of a stick, measuring out imaginary rooms, doorways, corners. The outline changed a dozen times, first too narrow, then too wide, then too impractical. He wasn't an architect. He wasn't even a handyman. But something inside him refused to accept that those things mattered. His hands, though raw and untrained, belonged to someone with no other choice. And sometimes the absence of choice was the most powerful blueprint of all. By mid-morning, he set out into the city, pushing the stroller with one hand and carrying an old canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He started walking routes he knew well by now, behind grocery stores, near construction sites, down alleyways where dumpsters overflowed with discarded packaging and lumber. He scanned every pile of junk with intention, looking not just for shelter, but for structure. Cracked pallets, splintered boards, discarded doors. Even broken chairs had legs worth saving. The first piece he found was a wooden bed frame, water-stained and heavy, leaning against a dumpster behind a motel. Its joints were loose, but the slats were strong. He pried it apart with a rock, careful not to make noise that would draw attention, and strapped the pieces to the sides of the stroller, using strips of cloth torn from an old curtain. The baby slept through the noise, rocked gently by the uneven sidewalk. Later, he found a long, narrow plank with only one jagged crack on the end. It was balanced atop a trash bin near a hardware store, as if waiting for someone like him. He took it, carried it on his shoulder while steering the stroller with care. He passed dozens of people, some glanced, some didn't. No one stopped him. His reflection in store windows looked like a caricature. The bearded man with a wild stare, a baby carriage weighed down with wood and wire. By the time the sun began to dip behind the city skyline, Elias had made 5 full loops across neighborhoods he once passed through without thought. The bag on his shoulder now held a dented hammer, 3 different types of nails, a screwdriver with a bent tip, and a handsaw missing 3 teeth. Items scavenged from donation bins or handed to him by people who didn't ask questions. Back at the lot, the wind had settled. The baby lay wrapped in his coat, cheeks red from the chill, eyes wide and watching. Elias kissed his forehead and began to unload the materials, stacking them against the wall of the factory with careful deliberation. He worked slowly, calculating the stability of each piece with nothing more than instinct. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and twisted roots, but he cleared a small area by hand, scraping away debris until he could kneel without fear of splinters. That night, under the weak glow of a street light several yards away, he drove the first nail. The sound echoed in the silence like a drumbeat. With every strike, he imagined something more. Not just a wall, but a line of defense. A marker in the dirt that told the world, here is where we begin. The first wall was crooked, patched together with 2 boards from the bed frame and a cracked closet door. He braced it with a metal rod shoved into the ground at an angle, held together with twine scavenged from a garden center trash bin. It wasn't much to look at. It didn't even stand straight, but it stood. He sat back on his heels, chest heaving, hands trembling, and let himself smile for the first time in days. His knuckles were scraped raw, and his fingertips tingled from the chill, but the pain only confirmed the truth of what he was doing. This was real, not a sketch, not a fantasy whispered under his breath to a sleeping child. It was here, in wood and nails and dirt, and it was only the beginning. The following days passed in rhythm with the city's breath. Elias rose with the sun, fed Luca using whatever he could find, discarded formula bottles, milk warmed at gas station coffee dispensers, and then set out to scavenge. He grew better at finding what others missed. A broken crib behind a daycare became the back frame of a future wall. A discarded screen door was repurposed into a partial roof when draped with a tarp held down by bricks. He began to keep a notebook stolen from a donation box near a church. In it, he sketched crude diagrams, measured and remeasured, adjusting for the warped materials he found. He studied the angles of real houses as he walked, watching how awnings sloped, how doors fit into frames, how windows sat flush with siding. He memorized everything. He had no ruler, so he used his forearm as a guide. No level, so he watched how water rolled across his boards after rain. Each evening, he returned to the lot with fresh pieces, some days only 1 or 2. Other days, if luck favored him, a dozen. He worked until the light was gone, sometimes past that, hammering and sawing by feel, whispering quiet encouragements to himself in the dark. When Luca cried, he stopped, soothed him, then returned to work. The baby seemed calmer now, as if sensing the shift. The ground beneath them no longer felt temporary. It was beginning to belong to them. Sometimes people passed by. A man walking his dog glanced in once, shook his head and kept walking. A group of teenagers stopped to stare one afternoon, laughing at the pile of misfit lumber, but left when Elias didn't react. He had learned to tune out their voices, the sneers, the dismissive glances. He had no time for pride. He had work to do. One afternoon, while searching near a condemned building, he found a stack of bricks beneath a collapsed staircase. Most were chipped, but they were heavy and real. He returned for them over 3 days, carrying 3 or 4 at a time in his canvas bag, his shoulders screaming from the weight. But the bricks became a makeshift foundation for the second wall, reinforcing the wooden planks that groaned under every breeze. Luca watched it all from his stroller, wide-eyed, curious. When Elias caught him smiling, he smiled back. When the baby laughed, he laughed too. They had no toys, no blankets beyond the 2 they shared. But they had space, a patch of earth carved out of concrete and steel, where they could rest without fear of being chased off. One night the temperature dropped suddenly, and Elias wrapped them both in layers of cloth, pressing Luca against his chest beneath the crude roof. Rain began to fall just after midnight, soft at first, then harder, relentless. He felt it leak through the cracks in the tarp, drip along the boards, soak into the floor. But the roof held longer than he expected. The wall did not fall, and when the storm passed just before dawn, Elias was still awake, shivering but dry, his son breathing quietly in his arms. That morning he found a man standing at the edge of the lot. He was older, with a hunched back and a face carved deep by time and sun. A faded ball cap clung to his head, and his hands were thick and scarred, tucked into the pockets of a frayed jacket. He didn't speak, just watched. Elias straightened slowly, eyes wary. The man nodded once, glanced at the crooked wall, and walked away without a word. Elias watched him go, unsure what to make of it. But something in the man's gaze had lingered, something that didn't feel like ridicule. The next day he found a small paper bag resting beside the stroller. Inside were a few bent nails, a stub of chalk, and 2 unbroken measuring tapes. No note, no signature, just tools. The message was clear: keep building. And so he did. He learned more with every mistake. When a wall leaned too far, he reinforced it with salvaged pipe. When the roof creaked, he tied it down with rope made from braided plastic bags. He began to see beauty in the imperfections, the mismatched panels, the uneven seams. Each flaw told a story. Each correction marked growth. And with each passing day, the outline of a home emerged from the rubble. Not a house, not yet. But something more important, a beginning. The rhythm of progress had become a balm. Day by day, Elias built with a quiet steadiness that made the hours blur, and the ache in his muscles feel earned rather than burdensome. The mornings began early now, not because he was forced awake by the discomfort of concrete or fear of displacement, but because purpose stirred him before the sun rose. He would lie still for a moment, listening to Luca's soft breathing beside him, and then carefully rise from their shared bedding, an assembly of old blankets layered over flattened cardboard, and step out into the air, stretching stiff limbs and scanning the skies like a farmer checking the weather. The frame of the structure had grown. There were now 3 walls, uneven but upright, patched with scavenged plywood, closet doors, and the repurposed bones of old furniture. Each piece bore the fingerprints of necessity. There were no straight edges, no fresh lumber, but the structure felt alive, like a creature taking shape from the discarded and forgotten parts of the city. Elias had managed to rig a kind of pitched roof using overlapping panels of plastic sheeting and a large curved piece of aluminum signage he dragged from an alleyway. When the wind hit it just right, the sign groaned softly, like an old ship's hull shifting against the tide. Inside, the floor was half covered with pallets lined up edge to edge. On top of them, Elias had laid old towels and a tarp for insulation. He had created a sleeping nook for Luca, surrounding the space with stacked crates and an old crib railing, padded with more cloth and newspaper for warmth. It wasn't a crib, but it was safety, and the baby slept more peacefully now than he had in weeks. The space, crude as it was, had begun to feel like something sacred. In the evenings, Elias would sit just inside the entryway, his legs stretched out in front of him, watching the sky change color through the jagged opening between roof and wall. Sometimes he talked aloud, narrating his plans for tomorrow's work or reading the faded words from the torn-out pages of a manual someone had tossed in the trash. Other times he just sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the city in the distance, the low hum of traffic, a dog barking, the rhythmic squeak of a passing bicycle. The world still moved, but here behind the factory, time bent and softened. One afternoon he found an old mirror, cracked diagonally, tossed beside a pile of broken tiles. He hauled it back to the lot and propped it against the inner wall. It reflected light through the room in a way that made it feel larger, brighter. He caught glimpses of himself in it, tired, gaunt, but somehow stronger. His eyes looked back with quiet resolve. He didn't smile often anymore, but that day he allowed himself one. When it rained, which it had several times now, the roof held better than expected. Some water still leaked through the seams, trickling down one corner wall, but Elias managed to redirect it with a piece of gutter he'd found in a demolition pile. The structure no longer felt like a pile of boards clinging together. It felt anchored, resilient, like it belonged. But the city didn't rest. It watched, and sometimes it bit back. It was early evening when he returned from a supply run to the other side of town. A thrift store had put out a broken shelf he thought he could turn into a window frame, and he'd spend the better part of the day hauling it back on a wheeled cart. Luca was bundled against his chest, sleeping under the layers of their shared coat. The sky was heavy with thick gray clouds, the kind that swallowed light in time. He was tired but content. Another good day, another piece found, another step forward. As he turned the corner onto the back lot, his breath caught. The shelter was in ruins. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The walls were no longer standing. One had collapsed entirely, its boards splintered and scattered across the dirt. The roof had been torn away from its makeshift fastenings and lay crumpled a few feet away, like a wounded bird. Inside, the crates were overturned. Luca's sleeping nook had been ripped apart. The mirror was shattered. Wood, cloth, rope, all of it ripped, broken, crushed. For a moment, he couldn't move. The sound of his own heartbeat thudded in his ears. Luca stirred against him, sensing the tension, and Elias instinctively held him tighter. He stepped forward slowly, numbness spreading through his limbs like frost. The more he looked, the more damage he saw. Someone hadn't just stumbled through the space. This was deliberate. Boards had been kicked in, nailed sections pried loose and tossed aside. Mud smeared across the floor. A trail of garbage, some of it their own, some brought in, was strewn around like mocking confetti. And on one of the still-standing boards, scrawled in red spray paint, were two words, "Junk Boy." Elias dropped to his knees, his fingers curled around a broken plank, the edges jagged, the nail still bent inside. He stared at it, unblinking, trying to push down the tremble in his hands. His throat burned. It wasn't just wood. It was weeks of labor, of hope, of something real, finally, after so much loss. A distant laugh echoed from somewhere beyond the fence. Faint but familiar. He didn't need to see who had done it. He already knew. There had been teenagers, passers-by who had watched him build. Some had mocked, others had filmed. He'd ignored them, told himself it didn't matter. But it had. They'd waited for him to be gone, and they'd taken everything. Tears pressed behind his eyes, but he held them back. Luca cooed softly, his warm breath against Elias's collarbone, a reminder that falling apart was not an option. Behind him, the sky cracked with thunder. That night, he didn't rebuild. He didn't search for supplies. He sat in the dirt beside the wreckage, his legs stretched out, the baby asleep on his chest. Rain fell in cold sheets, soaking through his clothes, dripping from his hair, pooling around his boots. He didn't flinch. He let it fall. Let it take what was left. Around midnight, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was deep and thick, broken only by the soft rustle of wind against metal. Elias closed his eyes, his back against the half-standing wall. In the dark, he thought of Alina, of her hands and the way she used to hum when folding laundry. He thought of Luca's smile, of the wall he had raised with shaking hands and a heart full of fire. He thought of walking away, of how easy it would be to disappear into the city, find a different alley, a different shelter, a different way to survive. But as the stars re-emerged overhead, pinpricks of stubborn light, he realized something he hadn't before. They hadn't taken his will. The structure was broken. The boards could be replaced. But the fire, the refusal to give up, to bend, to disappear, that was still there. Beneath the soaked clothes and bruised pride and aching hands, it still burned. Luca stirred in his sleep, a tiny sigh escaping his lips. Elias looked down, brushing a thumb along his cheek. "You're safe," he whispered silently. In the morning, he would rise. He would gather what was left. He would rebuild. But tonight, he would sit with the ruin, feel the weight of it, let it settle. Tomorrow he would begin again. And this time, he would not build alone. The sun rose slowly over the city, its pale light glancing off the twisted remnants of what had once stood as Elias's fragile fortress. The night had passed in silence, and though his body was stiff with cold, his chest held something harder than despair. He didn't wake so much as unfold from the sleep that had never truly come. The baby stirred first, whimpering softly beneath Elias's coat, and that was what broke the spell. Elias sat up, wincing, as muscles complained and wet fabric clung to his skin. His eyes fell again on the wreckage, but this time the ache that bloomed inside him was quieter, more focused. Grief had already had its turn. What remained now was the question of what came next. He stood slowly, pulling Luca close, and stepped toward the center of the broken shelter. The ground was muddy and uneven. The walls leaned like tired shoulders, but his feet moved with purpose. He crouched beside the overturned crates, righted them, brushed the dirt from the baby's bedding, and cleared a dry patch of ground. A breeze picked up, stirring the plastic that had once been the roof. It flapped weakly against the fence, torn in places but not entirely gone. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, his shoulders tensing. Standing at the edge of the lot was the same man from a week before, the older figure in the faded cap, arms crossed, watching. This time he didn't walk away. Elias straightened, unsure whether to speak. The man nodded once, stepping closer. His eyes moved across the destruction, lingering on the spray-painted insult and the broken boards. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't have to. "You gonna let them win?" The words were simple, unemotional, but they hit with the weight of a hammer. Elias said nothing. The answer was already in his stance, in the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. The man moved to the remaining wall and examined one of the beams. He tapped it with a knuckle, then turned back. "You built this?" he asked. Elias nodded once. The man gestured toward the tools scattered in the dirt. "Where'd you learn?" "Nowhere." "Humph." The man rubbed his jaw. "Well, you've got bad technique, but decent instincts." He stuck out a calloused hand. "Henry." And just like that, Elias had help. That same day, Henry returned with a weathered toolbox and a canvas bag filled with nails, brackets, and pieces of salvaged hardware. He brought no pity, no condescension, only a quiet kind of authority. He moved through the lot with the confidence of someone who had built things that lasted. He didn't take over. He didn't draw diagrams or give lectures. He simply pointed, demonstrated, and let Elias do the work. When Elias drove a nail too shallow or misaligned a board, Henry corrected him. Not with scolding, but with calm repetition. Each mistake became a lesson. Each correction a brick in a new foundation, not of wood, but of understanding. The rebuilding began the same afternoon. They tore down what was too damaged to salvage and sorted the rest into piles. Reusable, warped but fixable, and trash. Henry showed Elias how to use a chalk line for alignment, how to reinforce joints with diagonal cuts, how to brace walls so they could bear more weight. Elias absorbed everything, his hands clumsy at first but growing more confident with each passing hour. Word spread. The first to come was Mrs. Thompson from 2 blocks over, a short woman with silver curls and a heavy grocery cart. She appeared at the edge of the lot with a can of white paint and a bundle of folded sheets. "Heard what they did," she said quietly. "No child should sleep in the cold." She didn't stay long, just set the items down and left before Elias could thank her. Then came Mr. Lopez, the retired gardener who lived near the corner. He brought old tools from his shed, some barely functional, others still sharp from use. He patted Elias on the shoulder, muttered something in Spanish, and helped clear a space for the new wall. By the end of the week, there had been over a dozen visitors. Some brought nails, wood, rope. Others brought food, extra diapers, or simply stood and watched in silence, unsure of how to help but unwilling to turn away. A group of teenagers, strangers to Elias, asked if they could paint over the vandalism on the old wall. He gave them a nod. They returned the next day with brushes and a bucket of blue paint. When they finished, the word junk was gone, replaced by a mural of stars and birds. Even some of the kids who had laughed at him earlier showed up, lingering at the edges of the lot. They didn't speak at first, but their silence was different now, not mocking, but hesitant, unsure of whether they'd be welcomed. Henry said nothing. He handed one of them a hammer and pointed to a beam. The boy took it. A moment later, his friend followed. Luca watched all of this from his makeshift cradle, his wide eyes following every motion. When Elias paused to feed him, Henry took over the hammering without complaint. When Elias stepped back into the structure, now half raised again, he could see the difference. This was no longer a shelter built by one man's desperation. It was a collective, a promise written in wood, in sweat, and forgiveness. Elias worked harder than ever. He scavenged during the day, pulled nails from old boards, repurposed bed frames and shelving. At night, he measured and cut, hammering until his hands blistered anew. Henry showed him how to insulate the walls using layers of cardboard and quilted fabric, how to create drainage paths beneath the foundation, how to build a door that didn't stick. Elias followed every instruction, added his own touches, and slowly, board by board, the shelter became a home. They installed the roof together. Henry boosted Elias up onto a platform made from stacked cinder blocks, while he held the frame steady below. The wind tried to unmake their progress, but they worked in rhythm, side by side, with gritted teeth and steady hands. When the last shingle was nailed into place, a warped but solid piece of repurposed siding, they stood back and looked at it in silence. It wasn't symmetrical, it wasn't level, but it stood straight, and it was dry. Inside, the floor had been swept clean and layered with salvaged carpet squares. Elias built a small table using crate wood and fitted it beside the wall, just beneath the newly installed window, a pane of glass taken from an old picture frame, sealed with tape and putty. He found a broken lamp base at a junkyard and fitted it with a battery-powered bulb. At night, it glowed warm and soft, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Luca slept in a real crib now. Well, part of one, rebuilt from 3 different sets and padded with foam from an old sofa cushion. His tiny fingers curled around the edge as he looked out at the world beyond. One evening, as Elias was sanding the edges of a makeshift shelf, Tanya arrived with a pot of soup and a stack of folded clothes. She had seen the story in the local paper. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She hugged him tightly, kissed Luca's head, and sat with them in the doorway as the sun set. A few days later, a local news station showed up with cameras and microphones. Elias didn't want the attention. He tried to wave them off, but Henry stepped forward and spoke with calm authority. "Let them see," he said. "Let them know what's possible." The segment aired that night, and the story took on a life of its own. Donations arrived, letters, messages from people across the city, some offering help, others simply sharing that they'd been moved. A small architecture firm reached out, offering free consultation and materials. A community center invited Elias to speak at a youth workshop, but he didn't care for praise. What mattered was here, the walls he had raised, the warmth of his son asleep in the corner, the echo of hammers fading into the comfort of laughter. He stood in the doorway one night, arms crossed, watching the stars rise overhead. The city hummed beyond the fence, but here, within these patched-together walls, was quiet. He could see the curve of the roof, the lines of shadow cast by the window, the way the light danced across the floorboards. He didn't think of what had been lost anymore. He thought of what had been built, and what might still be built. This house beneath the sky, crooked, humble, beautiful, was not just his victory. It was a marker of something larger, a place where failure had been met with resolve, where strangers had become allies, and where a man and his child had carved out something unshakable. And when he stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, the creak of the hinges didn't sound broken anymore. It sounded like home. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video to discover another powerful journey, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.